An ANC task team has been set up to help the party process recommendations made against senior officials in the state capture inquiry report. The governing party is under pressure to act on findings against former President Jacob Zuma, NEC member Nomvula Mokonyane, and current chairperson Gwede Mantashe, among others, who have been named in this report. Well, we're joined now by social activist and former Minister and Mo Ibrahim Foundation board member J. Naidoo, and Institute for Security Studies Head of African Futures and Innovation, Dr. Jakkie Cilliers. Good evening to you, and thank you all for your time tonight. It's interesting to me that there seems to be a process, particularly stemming out of the governing party, to streamline how the recommendations of the multiple reports by the Zondo inquiry need to be implemented. One would have thought it's a simple issue, you know. Surely there must be some kind of separation around their officials, what they've done as, as deployees within the state versus how they're handled and managed by their own party. Mr. Naidoo?
Yes, I absolutely support your contention that 60 million South Africans who have waited more than 3 years, hundreds of witnesses and thousands of pages of evidence are waiting to see what the government is going to do. And what it's going to do and what is required is to see decisive action taken against those that have abused their power. And so, the evidence that the government needed to prove malfeasance has now been proven. Now it's up to the police to investigate on the basis of recommendations that are made, and for the National Prosecuting Authority to process the evidence and formulate the charges against those that have been accused. So I think that the ANC taking a decision to investigate those members of its leadership that are implicated, we are also waiting to see what action will be taken for those that have already been implicated by the Zondo Commission. And this is a commission handled by the acting Chief Justice. This is not a commission that can be disregarded. And Chief, Judge Zondo is someone that has a long track record of upholding the law, the rule of law. From the time I knew him, more than 3 decades ago, as a labor lawyer and a human rights lawyer working with Griffiths and Mthenge. So I am, like the rest of South Africans, want to see action, and perhaps understanding that the wheels of government bureaucracy work slowly. It cannot be years before we see decisive action taken against those implicated in the Zondo Commission reports.
Dr. Cilliers, if we are to reimagine how the implementation of the findings of this report and its recommendations ought to have been, what do you think should have happened?
Well, I think what is always important in considering what is going to happen now and how things are unfolding is just to compare what is happening now with what happened with South Africa's, largest previous inquiry, which of course was the arms deal inquiry. At that point, government, and particularly subsequently President Zuma, was trying to deliberately obstruct the investigation and whitewash and obstruct court proceedings. That did not, and it took several years for that process to come to court, and eventually then 2 people were were prosecuted on technical issues, Tony Ngeni and Shabir Sheikh. So I expect that converting the 50 billion pages, I think is what they said, and evidence that was given in front of the Zondo Commission into evidence that can stand up in a court of law is going to take, unfortunately, longer than any of us would want. I think it's heartening to see the slow but certainly determined progress that is being made by government and by the NPA in building its capacity to be able to prosecute. But I'm afraid this is unfortunately going to be a slow process. And of course, it comes at a very difficult time for the governing party, which is heading for elections in December of this year and then national elections 2024. Yet, I have little doubt that the integrity of the NPA is beyond reproach in this instance, but I do think that they are struggling with capacity, as they themselves have admitted.
Dr. Cilliers, what should happen to those people then who do have positions within the state? Should they continue in those jobs, despite the fact that you have now this issue that would be hanging over their heads?
You know, we have a very strict and constraining labor legislation in South Africa, and government itself is governed by, when it comes to labor legislation and rules of employment, by very cumbersome systems and procedures. Jay will know much more about this than I do. And the reality, and we've seen this over the last 2-3 decades, and that is that people just stay where they are. And government, they are suspended on full pay. Of course, what we would all like to see, and also within the governing party, is that those that are accused, that they step aside while the proceedings unfold. Unfortunately, I think that that's unlikely. But I do think this practice of people being suspended or going on extended leave or serving in their positions while on full pay, it just will not satisfy the ordinary South African who wants to see people taken to court, presented, and found guilty.
And Mr. Naidoo, just staying then with that last point, when we look at the reasons why the South African government has been receiving such declining levels in as far as the amount of trust that citizens have in them, it's because they believe that there is nothing serious done about corruption, and that effectively, if you hold a certain position in society or are linked to a certain group of people, you never are actually ever held accountable.
Well, it's not just a belief that others have. I have been part of government and I believe the same. That I've seen no real evidence of decisive action against something that is treasonous, an attack on our constitution, an attack in which our institutions have been hollowed out, an attack in which billions have been stolen in contravention with all the laws that govern finances, whether it's income or expenditure or contracting. We have seen the complicity of private sector companies like Bain, which masterminded this looting of our country. And I see very little evidence of them being held accountable, whether in South Africa or internationally. And there is legislation that exists internationally. In the U.S., you have the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Organization Act, in which companies like Bain, McKinsey, and a number of other Western companies, we don't need to go through that rogues gallery, have just been barefaced about, and with impunity, that nothing will happen to us. In fact, people that headed their operations in South Africa have been promoted. There's been no culpability. So I'm expecting that at least we can proceed with action, that where there's complicity and where there's been criminal actions committed. And that does not require a tremendous amount of capacity in the state. I think people have lost trust in this government. And not just trust in politicians, trust in the public, in the private sector itself. We are sitting at the point where all the signs of a failing state are visible to all of us. And the people with power that have abused power are negligent today in taking the actions that restore the trust of 60 million South Africans in democracy. So what's at stake here is much bigger than just a few people going to jail, which I hope to see. It's about restoring hope in our country. And that requires decisive action. It cannot be pushed out to touch anymore. We have lost patience now. And we've had enough as South Africans. There's been criminal acts committed by both politicians and by private sector companies. We know who they are. The evidence is there. They need to do the work that we pay them for. We need to see prosecutions. And we need to see a review of every state contract by these companies. We need to see complete disclosure of all contracts in future. So we have to look at the whole area of contracting and put that into the public arena, because it was journalists like yourself and whistleblowers and community-based activists that have exposed this corruption. It's never been government. It's never been someone in power. And so it's the action of South African citizens who had enough of corruption that has made this an issue today. And South Africans must never forget that.
Naidoo, Jakkie Cilliers, let me thank you both for your time tonight.